A wife's got no business with a trade. Royce Deming said it, looking not at Ottilie Rask, but at the two crates roped in the back of his wagon. The crates that held her potter's wheel broken down to its parts, her wooden ribs and wire tools, and the little sack of dried Bohemian clay her mother had pressed into her hands at the dock, as though it were a relic. He said it, the way you'd read off a price you have no intention of paying. Then he reached back, heaved both crates over the side, into the dust of the dry wash, clucked to his team, and drove north toward his good house and his good land, without once looking at the woman he had paid a stranger's passage to marry. Tilda stood in the bottom of the wash with the wind rising and did not scream after him, because screaming was a thing you spent when there was someone left to hear it, and there was no one for 11 miles in any direction. She was 26 years old. She had crossed an ocean and most of a continent on the strength of an advertisement, and she had answered that advertisement, not because she dreamed of a husband, but because a woman alone in a Chicago tenement, with a trade in her hands and no forge of her own to practice it, was a woman slowly being ground to nothing. The advertisement had said a man of property in Colorado wanted a capable wife. She had thought, foolishly, she saw now, that capable meant her hands would be welcome. She had made the mistake at the stage stop that morning of telling Royce Deming that she meant to set up her wheel and sell crocks and jars to the town, that she had done so in the old country and could do it here, that she would not be idle. She had watched his face close like a shutter. To the south, along the whole rim of the sky, a wall of dust was building the color of a healing bruise. Tilda dragged the crates up out of the wash to the higher ground by an old fence line, and she sat down on them with her back to the coming storm, and her mother's clay held against her chest, and she waited to find out how the country meant to kill her. Emmett Crane was not looking for anyone. He was riding the fence line of a played-out quarter section he had no love for, checking a windmill that had been groaning wrong for a week. When the dust wall swallowed the sun and the light went the flat brown of an old photograph, most men would have turned for home. Emmett had spent 3 years turning for home, keeping his head down, minding only his own small survival. And he had come to understand that a man who only ever saves himself is not saved at all. He is only postponed. So when he saw, through the murk, a shape hunched on the fence line where no shape ought to be, he rode toward it instead of away. She had wrapped her head in her shawl and her arms around a crate, and she did not startle when his horse loomed up out of the brown. She only lifted her chin and looked at him with gray eyes gone gritty and red, and said, in an accent he could not place, "I have no money. If you have come to rob me, you have come a long way for nothing." "I've come to get you out of this wind," Emmett said. "There's a dugout a half-mile back with a sound roof. You can hate me for it later." She weighed him a long while, the way you'd test a stranger's clay to see if it would hold. Then she stood, and the first thing she did, before she took his offered hand, before she saw to herself at all, was hand him one of the crates and say, "Then take this. Careful. It matters more than I do." They did not make the dugout before the worst of it. They made it to the lee of a cutbank and put the horse and the crates between themselves and the storm and breathed through their shawls, while the world went to grit and howl. And Emmett Crane, who had learned to expect nothing of anyone, found himself remembering the crate in his arms the whole time, holding it out of the wind because she had told him it mattered, and something in the way she'd said it had made him believe her. The dugout was his own, though he didn't tell her that yet, a half-cave cut into a north-facing bank, sod-roofed, where he'd been living cheap while he dug wells and raised windmills for other men across 3 counties, and saved against the day he could buy back the kind of land his brother had cheated him out of. It was mean, and it was dry, and it had a stove. And by the time the storm blew itself thin, and the stars came out hard and cold, the woman across the fire had told him her name, and almost nothing else. Rask, she said. Ottilie Rask. Tilda. She turned her hands to the fire. Strong hands, he saw, scarred and burned in ways he understood, because his own were the same. I am a potter. I was to marry Mr. Deming of this county. He decided at the stage road that he did not want a wife who would rather stand at a wheel than stand at his stove. She said it flatly, but her jaw was tight. So, now you know the whole foolish story. Emmett was quiet a moment, feeding a twist of grass to the fire. Deming, he said. The one with the section on Antelope Draw, runs cattle. Talks in church. You know him, I've dug his wells. He pays slow and complains fast. Emmett looked at her across the fire. He put you out in the wash to save himself the shame of sending you back on the stage where folks would ask why. Left you to the storm and told himself the weather did it, not him. He'd seen it before, in men like Royce Deming, the trick of arranging things so the cruelty had no fingerprints. That's not a man who changed his mind about a wife. That's a coward covering his tracks. Tilda studied him then, truly studied him, and some of the flint went out of her. You say that very sure. I know the kind, Emmett said, and did not explain, and she did not ask. She lasted 1 day as a guest. On the second morning, Emmett woke to find her already up, the crates open, the parts of her wheel laid out on a horse blanket in an order that plainly meant something to her, and Tilda herself down on her knees at the mouth of a little side cut in the bank, digging into the exposed clay with his own spade and rubbing the wet earth between her fingers with a look on her face he had not seen there before. This is good, she said, not looking up. Do you know what you are living on top of? This is stoneware clay. Gray, plastic, few stones. In the old country, men fought over a bank of clay like this. She held up a fistful, worked it into a rope, bent the rope into a ring without it cracking. See? It bends and it does not break. That is the whole secret of a crock that will hold your water and not weep it away. Earthenware you fire soft, and it drinks like a sponge. This, she squeezed the ring back into a ball. This, you fire hot and salt it, and it turns to something near as hard as stone. It will not leak, it will not sour, it will keep a family's meat and water through a summer like the one that's coming. Emmett crouched beside her. The one that's coming. You have not looked at the sky? There has been no rain. The grass is already curling. She wiped her hands on her apron. In a wet year, a town does not think about its crocks. In a dry year, the crock is the difference between food that keeps and food that rots, water that stays sweet and water that breeds sickness. Your county is going to need what my hands make, Mr. Crane. Whether or not one fool decided a woman's hands were beneath him. She rocked back on her haunches. I need a wheel pit, a drying shed, and a kiln. And I need to not freeze or starve while I build them. That is my whole difficulty. Are you a man who will help, or a man who will watch? It was not a soft way to ask. It was, Emmett thought, the least self-pitying speech he had ever heard from someone who had every right to a great deal of self-pity, and it decided him. I dig for a living, he said. I'll dig you a wheel pit, and I'll raise you a windmill over that side cut, so you've water without hauling. But the kiln I don't know. The kiln I know, said Tilda. You dig. I will teach you the rest. That was how it began between them. Not with sweet talk, of which neither had the least gift, but with clay. She taught him to win the clay first, to dig it, and pick the stones and roots from it, and slake it in water in an old trough until it was smooth, and let it stiffen on a bed of dry ash until it could be lifted. Then she taught him to wedge it, which astonished him, the way she threw the heavy lump down and cut it on a wire and slammed the halves together, over and over, her whole slight body behind it. To drive the air out, she said, breathing hard. An air pocket in the clay is a little bomb. It turns to steam in the fire, and it bursts the pot, and often the pots around it. A lazy wedging loses you a whole kiln. She put his hands on the lump and made him feel the difference between clay that was ready and clay that was not, the way a baker feels bread. His scarred hands, that knew iron and augers, and the cold throats of wells, learned the warm live weight of it slowly, and she was a hard teacher and a fair one, and he found he did not mind. But it was the wheel that undid him. He dug her the pit as he'd promised, so she could sit at ground level with the great flywheel down below where her foot could kick it. And she set the wheel head, true with a carpenter's level, and a muttered bohemian prayer, and then she centered a ball of the gray clay and kicked the wheel into its slow, heavy spin, and put her wet hands down, and the shapeless lump rose up between her palms into a spinning column, smooth and true and alive, and then opened and lifted and became, in the space of 100 heartbeats and as if by no effort at all, a tall, clean crock with a rolled lip standing where a fistful of dirt had been. Emmett Crane had raised barns and drilled 200 feet of dry rock, and he had never in his life seen anything made so fast out of so little. And he said a word under his breath that he only ever said in church. Tilda cut the finished crock free with a wire, not looking up, but he saw the corner of her mouth. "Now you," she said, "you will be very bad at it. Everyone is very bad at it. Sit." He was very bad at it. The clay fought him and flew off the wheel and slapped the wall of the pit, and she laughed. The first time he'd heard it, a short, surprised sound she seemed to catch and put away as if she'd forgotten she owned it. But she stood behind him and put her burned hands over his scarred ones and steadied them against his knees, the way you'd gentle a green horse, and said, "Stop fighting it. You cannot force clay, it only fights back harder. You must be firm, and you must be still, and you must let it come up to you." And under her hands his hands went still, and the clay stopped fighting, and rose a little, lopsided and thick, but a wall, a beginning, a thing where nothing had been. Neither of them said anything about her hands on his, but neither of them moved them for a while, either. What grew between the two of them grew the way stoneware takes a glaze, slowly, in the heat, from the outside in, until you cannot say where. The clay ends and the shine begins. She built her drying shed of scrap lumber he hauled from a fallen homestead. He raised a windmill over the side cut, and the water came up cold and steady while the creeks went to cracked mud. She threw crocks and jars, and butter jars, and great water coolers, and set them to stiffen, and turned them, and stacked the drying shed full of gray ghost-pale ware. And all across the county, as June burned into July and no rain came, and the wells that hadn't been dug deep began to fail, word got around, the way it does, that there was a woman out at the Crane dugout who could make a crock that held. They came for the water coolers first, the deep double-walled ones. She showed them how to hang a wet cloth over, so the seep and the dry wind would keep the water inside cold as a cellar. Then the wives came for the big preserving crocks, because a drought summer is a summer you cannot waste a thing, and a good salt-glazed crock will keep sauerkraut, salt pork, and pickled beans sound clear to spring. Uncle Doc Ferris, the old freighter who hauled for half the county and had buried 2 wives and outlived most of his enemies, took one look at Tilda's ware and made himself her wagon and her salesman both, carrying crocks to the far ranches and coming back with orders and flour and news. It was Uncle Doc who brought the first bad news, too, sitting his mule in the yard with his hat pushed back. "That Deming," he said, "has been talking, down at Pruitt's store and at the church both. Says his mail-order woman robbed him and run off, took bride money he'd advanced and a deed besides, and's holed up out here, living in sin with the well-digger." He looked from Emmett to Tilda and back, unhurried. "Now I know a lie when it's got that particular stink. But a lie in a small town grows legs, and the sheriff's a by-the-book man. Thought you'd want to hear it from a friend before you hear it from the law." Tilda had gone very still, a wet crock forgotten under her hands. I took nothing from that man. I never reached his house. He put me out in the wash. "I believe you, daughter," said Uncle Doc. "That and a nickel gets you a nickel's coffee. What Deming's got is a story that lets folks think ill of a foreign woman and a poor man, which is a story folks are always glad to buy." He gathered his reins. "You're going to have to answer it, out loud, where they can all hear." Emmett found her that evening at the wheel, not throwing, only sitting, her foot idle on the kick bar and her hands flat on her knees. "I have done this before," she said, when he lowered himself to the edge of the pit. "Not the wheel, the other thing. Being the stranger a town decides to blame when it wants to feel clean." She turned a wooden rib over in her fingers. "In Bohemia, they blamed my grandmother, who was a healer, when a rich man's child died of a fever no one could have cured. In Chicago, they blamed us for taking work, for talking wrong, for praying wrong. I have learned that when people are frightened, and a drought frightens people to the bone, they must have someone to be frightened at. It is easier than being frightened at the sky." She looked at him. "I can run. I have run before. I am good at it. Where would you go?" "Somewhere with clay and no one who knows my name." She said it without much heart. Emmett was quiet a while. Down the draw, the windmill turned and knocked. Then he said, "When my brother took my land, he did it with papers, all legal, while I was off soldiering. Forged a line here, witnessed a lie there. And by the time I came home, it was his and the county believed it always had been. And I let it stand. I told myself a man can't fight paper and family both, and I picked up my augers, and I went to digging other men's wells, and I have spent 3 years being right about that, and it has felt exactly like being dead." He worked the hat slowly around in his scarred hands. "I ran, Tilda. Legal and quiet and reasonable, I ran. And the only thing it protected was Royce Deming's kind of man everywhere, forever, because a lie that nobody stands up to just becomes the truth and gets to do it again to the next one." She was watching him now. "I don't think you should run," he said. "Not because you owe this county anything. You don't. But because you're the one holding the water this summer, and they know it. And that's a thing a lie can't cover if we make them look at it in the daylight." He met her eyes and held them, which cost him. "Stand up where the whole town can see you, and I'll stand next to you. That's the only promise I've got, but it's a true one." Tilda held his gaze a good while. Then she picked up a fresh ball of clay and slapped it down on the wheelhead and centered it and began. Because her hands thought better than her fear did. "Then we will need," she said, "a great many crocks between now and Sunday. If the town is going to decide who I am, let them decide it standing in front of the ware that kept their food." The reckoning came, as such things do, at the church on a hot, bright Sunday with the whole county packed into the pews to escape the sameness of the dry days. Sheriff Pruitt was there, uncomfortable in his collar, a folded writ in his breast pocket. Royce Deming was there in his good coat, flanked by two cousins, wearing the easy calm of a man who has told a story so often that he believes it. And Tilda Rask came in on Emmett Crane's arm, in a clean, plain dress with her burned hands folded in front of her. And the whispering ran through the church like wind through wheat. Deming did not wait for the sermon. He stood up in the middle of the hymn, which told Tilda something about how sure he was. "Sheriff, there's the woman, there's the thief. I paid her passage in good faith to be my wife, and she stole from me and ran off to shack up with the well-digger. I want my money and my deed, and I want the law to do its work." He looked around the church, gathering the frightened, righteous faces the way he'd gathered them at the store. A man's got a right to protect what's his. Sheriff Pruitt stood slowly, the writ in his hand, and he looked like a man being asked to swallow something whole. "Miss Rask, there's a complaint sworn against you. Theft of $40 and a quarter-section deed. It's my job to take you in till it's sorted," he said it heavily. "You got anything to say to it?" "I do," said Tilda, and she kept her voice low, so that the church had to fall quiet to catch it. "I never reached that man's house. I never saw his money or his deed. He looked at my potter's wheel at the stage road, and he decided a wife with a trade of her own shamed him, and he threw my crates in the dry wash and left me there as the dust storm came on and drove home to tell you all that the weather is a cruel thing." She let it sit. "Search my crates, Sheriff. You will find clay and tools and $40 of nothing. What I have I made, with these." She held up her hands, and the burns and the gray seams in the knuckles showed even from the back pews. For a moment the silence hung, and then, from 3 rows back, a woman stood, one of the Wickstrom girls, a young wife with a baby on her hip. "Her water cooler's the only reason my milk's kept sweet since the creek went bad," she said, her voice shaking but climbing. "I don't know about deeds. I know she's kept my baby in clean water 3 weeks running, and that man never kept anybody anything." Then another stood. "My preserving crocks came off her wheel," said a broad rancher's wife near the front. "Everything I'll eat this winter is going in Tilda Rask's jars. A thief doesn't teach you to hang a wet cloth to cool your own water for free, which is what she did for me." Then old Uncle Doc, from the back, not standing so much as unfolding, his hat in his hand. "I've hauled her ware to 40 ranches and hauled back the truth along with the orders. Ain't a family on the Arikari that isn't drinking cleaner and eating longer this summer on account of that woman's 2 hands. You want to talk about who robbed, who, Sheriff? Ask Royce Demings to show you the wash where he left a human being to die, and let's all go have a look at the tracks." And Emmett Crane stepped forward, into the aisle, and reached into his coat and laid a paper on the communion rail. "Deming says she stole a deed. Here's the record from the county clerk that I rode 2 days to fetch. There's no deed missing from Royce Deming's name, not 1 acre. He can't have a thing stolen that he still holds free and clear, and a man who swears out a lie under oath about a theft has told you everything you need to know about the rest of his story." He looked at his old life and his old cowardice square in the face, in the shape of Royce Deming, and he did not look away. "I ran from a man like you once. I'm done running." The church was standing now, in 1s and 2s and then in a wave, and it was not standing for Royce Deming. Sheriff Pruitt looked at the clerk's record a long time. Then he folded his writ back into his pocket and turned to Deming and said, in a voice gone hard, "Royce, I think you'd best explain to me about a wash and some tracks, and a woman left out in a storm. Abandonment's a crime in this state. So's swearing a false complaint. And the confident face finally cracked, and Royce Deeming gathered his cousins and pushed out of the church into the white light, and the door banged behind him, and that was the end of him in that country. Emmett turned to Tilda in the emptying church. "You had a clerk's record the whole time," she said. "You rode 2 days and did not tell me. I didn't want to promise you a thing I couldn't put in your hand," he said. "I've had enough of men who promise." Tilda looked at him, at this large, quiet man who dug in the dark for other men's water and had gone and dug in the county's dusty ledgers for her name, and she felt something in her that had been held clenched since the deck at Hamburg come slowly open. "I do not want land of my own," she said. "You will offer it, I think. You are that kind, but I have had a whole life of my own, and it is a cold thing. I want a wheel pit, and a kiln, and a windmill, and a hard, fair man who holds the crate out of the wind, because I told him it mattered." She took his scarred hand in both of her burned ones. "Stay with me. That is the whole of what I am asking." "That," said Emmett Crane, "I can do." The first real rain came in September, and it came the day they lit the big kiln for the largest firing Tilda had ever attempted. She had built the kiln herself of her own hard brick. A long, low wood-burning tunnel banked into the hill, and Emmett had stacked it under her direction 3 days, running, and now they fed it, while the county's whole autumn supply of crocks came up slowly to a heat that made the dark bricks glow the dull red of a sunset. And at the peak of it, Tilda took handful after handful of common salt and threw it into the firebox, and it flashed to vapor and settled on the white-hot pots as a glass-hard skin. That beautiful, pebbled orange-brown salt glaze that would let no water and no rot and no year pass through it. Emmett watched the salt smoke roll from the chimney and thought it the finest thing he had ever helped to make. The rain started while the kiln was still cooling. They stood at the open door of the drying shed and watched it come across the burned land, and the whole dry country turned dark and sweet-smelling under it, and Tilda put her clay-dusted hand out into the wet and laughed her short, surprised laugh, and did not put it away this time. They were married that fall by a circuit preacher, in front of Uncle Doc and half the Arikari families who had stood up in the church, and the wedding gift the county gave them was more orders than 2 people could fill. So the next spring they took on a 3rd pair of hands, a half-grown orphan girl named Winnie, whose folks had died in the same fever season that killed so many, and who had been passed from house to house as an extra mouth until she'd stopped expecting to be wanted anywhere. Tilda set her at the wheel the first week. "You will be very bad at it," she told the girl. "Everyone is very bad at it. That is not a reason to stop. It is only the beginning." And she stood behind the child and put her burned hands over the small ones and steadied them and said, "Stop fighting it. Be firm and be still and let it come up to you." And Emmett, mending a kiln brick across the yard, heard her say it and had to stop a moment and look at the hills. The pottery on the Arikari ran for 30 years. Its salt-glazed crocks are still turned up whole in the dirt of that country, hard as the day they were fired, watertight, sound, a little gray clay, from a played-out quarter section, dug by a man who stopped running, and shaped by a woman a proud fool threw away, and now holding, still, whatever a family needs kept. I have turned this story over more often than I can rightly count, and what stays with me is not the storm or the reckoning, but a smaller thing. Royce Deming looked at a woman's working hands and saw something beneath him, an embarrassment. a wife who wouldn't fit the small shape he had ready for her. He measured her by what she would do for him, found the sum too low, and threw her out to save himself the cost of admitting it.